first note was wrong, not out of tune, not sloppy. Wrong in a way that made her hands freeze above the keys. A note that didn't belong to the rest of the music. A note that felt like a warning. Why would a composer do that on purpose? The attic was silent except for her breathing and the faint creak of the old house settling around her. Dust floated in the beam of a single light bulb. The score lay open on a wooden crate, its pages yellowed, edges curled, ink faded but deliberate. Whoever wrote this had known exactly what they were doing, and they had never wanted anyone to play it. The score had no title, no composer's name, just a date written in pencil on the inside cover. March 17, 1998, 2 years before the man everyone called her grandfather stopped speaking altogether. What no one realized at that moment was that this music had been waiting. Not to be admired, not to be performed, but to be understood. She had found the trunk by accident while cleaning out the attic after her grandmother's death. It was heavy, sealed with a rusted clasp, pushed into a corner behind old coats and broken chairs. Inside were letters she didn't recognize, photographs with faces scratched out, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, the score. Even before she played it, the pages felt tense. Dense with markings, unusual time changes, abrupt silences written directly into the measures. It didn't read like a song meant to please an audience. It read like someone trying to say something they were never allowed to say out loud. Her family had always been quiet about the past. Not secretive in an obvious way, just careful. Conversations ended abruptly when certain names came up. Questions were met with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Music, especially, was never discussed, which made no sense because everyone knew her grandfather had once been a musician. Had once. She pressed the first chord again. The wrong note rang out, hanging in the air longer than it should have. The harmony that followed felt strained, almost anxious, as if the music itself was anticipating something bad. Halfway through the first page, she noticed something else. Tiny pencil marks between the staff lines, almost invisible. Numbers, letters. At first, she assumed they were performance notes. But when she leaned closer, her stomach tightened. They weren't musical instructions, they were dates, scattered through the piece. When every few pages, some crossed out, some circled, some underlined with shaking lines as if written in anger or fear. Why would someone hide dates inside a score? And why would those dates line up with moments her family never talked about? What she didn't know yet was that the music wasn't just telling a story. It was keeping time, marking events, recording things no one was supposed to remember. As she turned the page, the melody shifted, became darker, more fragmented. Notes climbing too high, then dropping suddenly like something falling. The rhythm began to fracture, bars shortening, then stretching as if time itself was unstable. This detail would later change everything, because when she compared the first major shift in the music to the dates written in the margins, it matched the year her grandfather abruptly quit performing. The year he sold his piano. The year he moved his family across the country without explanation. She had been told he was sick, burned out, tired of the industry, but the music said something else. The next section introduced a second melodic line, subtle, almost hidden beneath the main theme. It repeated a pattern that didn't resolve, over and over, like a voice trying to interrupt but never quite managing to break through. She felt a pressure in her chest as she played it, a sense of intrusion, as if she was listening to something she was never meant to hear. The house seemed too quiet. Downstairs, the old clock ticked, loud and uneven. Each second felt deliberate, measured. Just like the music, she reached the end of the first movement and stopped. Her hands were trembling. Why would someone go to this much effort to hide a message in music? Why not write it down? Why bury it? In a place where only someone who could read and play it would ever find it? And most disturbing of all, why did it feel like the score was reacting to her understanding it? She closed the book slowly, suddenly aware of how alone she was in the house, of how many years this trunk had sat untouched, of how many people had chosen silence instead of truth. Somewhere in her memory, she recalled her grandmother once saying, "Some things stay quiet because they're still dangerous." At the time, it sounded poetic. Now it sounded like a warning, because this wasn't just a forgotten composition. It was evidence, and once the music had been played, it couldn't be unheard. What exactly had her grandfather been trying to confess? And who in the family had worked so hard to make sure this score was never found? She waited 3 days before showing the score to anyone, not because she doubted what she'd seen, but because every time she thought about explaining it out loud, something inside her tightened, as if the music itself was asking her to slow down, to listen longer. When she finally brought the score to her mother, she didn't start with questions. She placed it on the kitchen table and watched her mother's face carefully. The reaction was immediate, not surprise. Recognition. Her mother's hand froze mid-motion. The color drained from her face. For a long moment, she just stared at the date on the inside cover. March 17th, 1998. That shouldn't exist, her mother said quietly. The words landed heavier than any confession. Her mother tried to laugh it off, said it must be an old exercise piece, something unfinished, something meaningless. But she wouldn't touch it, wouldn't turn the pages, wouldn't even look at the notes. That refusal said more than any answer could have. Later that night, alone again, she spread the pages across the floor and began mapping the annotations. Every date, every crossed-out number, every strange symbol. Tucked between measures, a pattern emerged. The dates aligned with moments her family history treated like blank spaces. A sudden job change, an unexplained falling out with a close relative, a hospitalization no one ever described, a funeral she remembered attending as a child, without ever being told who had died, and threaded through all of it was the second. Melody, the buried one, the voice beneath the voice. This detail would later become impossible to ignore. Because when she isolated that hidden melody and played it alone, stripped of harmony, it sounded less like accompaniment and more like a response, a contradiction. As if two people were speaking over each other inside the same piece of music, one confident, one terrified. She found the dedication near the middle of the score, so faint it was almost erased. For L. Just one letter. At first, she assumed it was her grandmother. But the timeline didn't fit. The emotional tone didn't fit either. This wasn't love. It was apology. Regret pressed into sound. She searched through old photo albums until she found her Lena. Her grandfather's younger sister, a gifted violinist, the one who disappeared from family gatherings before she was born, the one no one ever mentioned. Officially, Lena had moved away. That was the story. But there were no later photographs, no letters, no phone calls, just absence. The music changed again after the date marked beside Lena's last appearance in the family records. The harmony collapsed. The rhythm fractured completely. Measures were overwritten. Notes scratched out so hard the paper nearly tore. This wasn't artistic struggle. This was panic. She began to understand why the score had been hidden, why it wasn't published, why it had no name. This wasn't meant for an audience. It was meant to survive. When she tracked down one of her grandfather's former students, now retired and living alone, she didn't mention the score at first. She asked about the man she barely knew. The quiet one, the one who flinched at sudden sounds, the one who never spoke about his past. The student hesitated. He stopped trusting silence, he said finally. He used to say quiet was where mistakes hid. When she showed him a photograph of Lena, his expression changed. She was better than him, he admitted. Everyone knew it. She had something raw. Fearless. Then he went quiet. There was an incident, he said. No one ever wrote it down. The pieces were coming together too quickly now. The annotations in the score weren't just dates. They were markers, moments where something went wrong, moments where a choice was made, and the music documented each. 1. The second melody reached its peak near the end of the score, loud, insistent, almost pleading. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Cut off mid-phrase. The final pages were nearly blank. Just rests, silence, written deliberately. She realized then that the music didn't end. It was silenced, and that silence had cost more than a career, more than a family's comfort. It had erased a person. When she confronted her mother again, this time with specifics, the denial cracked. There were rules, her mother said. Back then, about reputation, about protecting what mattered. What mattered to who? She asked. Her mother didn't answer. That night, listening to the recording she'd made of the score, she noticed something else, something subtle, something she had missed before. In the background, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of breathing, not hers, not from the room, embedded in the recording itself. As if someone had been standing close to the instrument when the piece was first played. Too close. Listening. Waiting. And suddenly, the question wasn't just what the music revealed. It was who had been there when it was created. And why the family had been so desperate to make sure no one ever listened closely enough to hear it. What really happened to Lena? And how far had someone gone to keep that truth buried in silence? The older relatives did not want to talk, not because they didn't remember, but because remembering meant choosing a side they had avoided for decades. Every phone call ended the same way. Long pauses, redirected conversations, carefully chosen, words that said nothing, until one person didn't hang up. Her great-aunt, Miriam, was 91 years old and nearly blind. Her voice shook when she heard Lena's name, but she didn't pretend not to recognize it. We were told to forget her, Miriam said, so we did. That's how families survive. That sentence carried more weight than any accusation. Miriam remembered. The night everything changed. A small concert. A private audience. Lena was meant to perform a new piece, her own composition. The one she'd been working on in secret. The one she believed would finally pull her out from under her brother's shadow. But she never played it. According to Miriam, there was an argument backstage. Voices raised. A door slammed. Then silence. Not the kind that comes after applause. The kind that makes people look at each other without speaking. The official story was that Lena panicked and walked away from music altogether, that she couldn't handle pressure, that she chose a different life. But Miriam's voice lowered when she said the next part. She didn't leave, she said. She was made to disappear. The score suddenly made sense. The second melody wasn't just a hidden voice. It was Lena's, interwoven, interrupted, overridden by the dominant line. The dates weren't just markers of time. They were moments of control tightening, of choices narrowing. Her grandfather hadn't just been documenting guilt. He had been recording a crime. What no one realized at the time was how powerful the music would become once it was understood. Because when she shared the isolated second melody with a musicologist, the reaction was immediate. This is a confession, he said. Not metaphorical, structural. The interruptions aren't artistic. They're intentional erasures. The harmonies clashed in places they shouldn't. Resolutions were delayed unnaturally. The composition was built to feel wrong, because something wrong had happened during its creation and buried deep in the final movement, almost impossible to hear unless you knew exactly where to listen, was a sequence that repeated Lena's name. Not spelled out in letters, but encoded in pitch. This detail would later force the family to confront something they could no longer deny, because Lena hadn't vanished quietly. She had tried to speak. The betrayal came into focus slowly. Not one dramatic act, but a series of decisions. Contracts signed, opportunities blocked, a reputation quietly dismantled. Her grandfather, once praised as a protector of tradition, had leveraged his influence to ensure Lena was never heard again. And when she threatened to expose him, when she refused to stay silent, the family closed ranks. No police report, no missing person notice, no questions asked. Just silence. The music stopped the same year Lena did. When confronted with this, her mother broke down. Not in denial, in grief. She admitted what she'd always known but never said aloud. There were meetings, she whispered. Conversations about damage control, about how her instability could destroy everything. Everything meant the family name, the legacy, the carefully curated image of brilliance without scandal. Lena became the cost. The score was hidden not because it was unfinished, but because it was too complete, because it preserved the truth too precisely, because anyone who truly listened could hear what words never recorded. Her grandfather's final years took on new meaning. The isolation, the refusal to speak, the way he flinched whenever music played unexpectedly. He had not lost his voice. He had surrendered it. The last pages of the score, the long stretches of silence, weren't emptiness. They were a sentence, a punishment he imposed on himself, silence, as penance. But penance without confession only traps the truth longer. When the family finally gathered to hear the piece played in full, no one spoke during the final measure. No one applauded. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the floor. Because the music did not ask for forgiveness. It demanded acknowledgement. And once it ended, there was no pretending it hadn't spoken. The question now was no longer what happened. To Lena, it was why it took a forgotten score, hidden for decades, to make the family listen. And whether breaking the silence now was an act of healing, or just another way of arriving too late. The house felt different after the music was played in full, not quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding breath. In the days that followed, no one rushed to make statements or apologies. There were no dramatic confrontations, just small, painful acknowledgments, glances that lingered too long, conversations that stopped halfway through a sentence. The kind of reckoning that unfolds slowly when denial is no longer possible but acceptance still hurts. The family's first instinct was still protection, not of Lena, of the story they had told themselves for decades. There were discussions about whether the score should remain private, about whether revealing the truth would only reopen wounds, about whether silence, once again, might be the kinder option. But the music had already done what words could not. It had removed the illusion of innocence. The recordings were shared quietly with historians, then with legal counsel, then, reluctantly, with an independent archivist specializing in suppressed artistic works. Each expert reached the same conclusion. This was not just a personal artifact. It was evidence of systematic erasure. The archivist pointed out something no one else had noticed. The trunk where the score had been hidden wasn't locked to protect it from discovery. It was locked to protect it from being destroyed. Someone had wanted it preserved. That realization shifted the family's understanding of the man they had. Called grandfather, he had taken away Lena's future. That much was undeniable, but he had also ensured the truth survived him, not through confession, not through courage, but through craft. The score was his compromise, his crime, and his conscience. bound together. When the family finally released a statement acknowledging Lena's existence and disappearance, it was brief, carefully worded. Still incomplete, but it was the first time her name had been spoken publicly in over 20 years, and it mattered. A small memorial was held in a local concert hall. No headstone, no remains, just music. The second melody was played alone, without interruption, without suppression. For the first time, it resolved. People in the audience wept without fully understanding why. Art has a way of doing that, of reaching places facts cannot. Afterward, her mother admitted something she had never said before. She tried to tell me, she said, before everything went quiet. I just didn't listen. That confession hurt more than any accusation. Healing did not come quickly. It didn't arrive with closure or forgiveness. It came in fragments, in late-night conversations, in shared grief, in the slow dismantling of a family myth that had required someone else's disappearance to survive. The score was archived under Lena's name, not his. That decision angered some relatives, relieved others. It ended arguments that had lasted generations, but it also raised a final, uncomfortable question. If the music had never been found, would the truth have ever surfaced? Or would silence have won again? The attic was cleaned out weeks later, the trunk removed, the dust gone. But something lingered, not a presence, a responsibility, because the story didn't end with exposure. It ended with choice, with the decision to listen when something uncomfortable speaks, to question inherited narratives, to ask who benefits from silence. The music had survived because someone feared forgetting more than being discovered. And now it asked the same of anyone who heard it. How many other truths are still hidden in plain sight? How many voices were erased so others could remain unchallenged? And if a melody can carry guilt for decades, waiting patiently to be understood, what else is quietly waiting for someone brave enough to listen?